Hey guys, tonight we step softly into a palace corridor draped in heavy black cloth, where even the candles seem unsure how brightly they're allowed to burn. You can almost feel it, the air thick with perfume, dust, and the unspoken understanding that grief here is not private, not spontaneous, and definitely not optional. Somewhere behind a door, a bell tolls with deliberate slowness, and you realize this isn't mourning the way you know it. This is mourning with rules, penalties, and witnesses. And yeah, quick reality check. You probably won't survive this emotionally if you're expecting sincere sadness instead of carefully managed theatre. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, drop your location and local time in the comments. I always love seeing where in the world you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You don't begin with death, you begin with instruction. The moment a royal death occurs, you're not allowed to react naturally. Instead, you wait, you listen, you watch for signals. Somewhere deep inside the palace, officials consult manuals thicker than your arm, documents outlining who cries, when they cry, how long they cry, and most importantly, who sees them cry. Royal mourning has never been about processing loss. It has always been about controlling what grief looks like when power is watching itself. You walk through these rituals as if they're somber and respectful, but very quickly you sense the machinery behind them. Black cloths aren't hung just to express sorrow, they are deployed like flags. In many European courts, the length of time black fabric stayed on the walls signaled political stability. Too short, and it suggested impatience or disrespect. Too long, and it hinted at weakness, stagnation, even vulnerability to rivals. A mainstream historical fact often overlooked is that during the early modern period, English and French courts issued official proclamations dictating exactly how long mourning would last for each rank of death, from monarchs down to distant cousins. This wasn't etiquette. This was governance. You notice how silence itself is weaponized. Bells toll at prescribed hours. Music is banned, then cautiously reintroduced. Laughter becomes suspicious. If you're a courtier, every sound you make feels like a gamble. And here's a quirky tidbit that tends to slip through textbooks. In some courts, even pets were symbolically included in mourning. Horses were draped in black, falcons hooded longer than usual, hunting dogs kept from the fields, not because anyone thought animals grieved like humans, but because visibility mattered. Mourning had to be total, no gaps. No joy leaking through the cracks. You might think grief would be a moment where hierarchy softens, where everyone stands equal before death. You would be very wrong. Mourning actually sharpens hierarchy. Who gets to wear deep black versus dull grey? Who is permitted jewellery? And who must strip themselves bare of ornament? Even the texture of fabric mattered. Velvet versus wool, silk versus crepe. Each choice whispering a reminder of rank. You learn quickly that grief is just another language of class, and historians still argue whether these rituals were primarily about emotional containment or political intimidation. Some suggest the rules offered structure during chaos, a way to prevent panic after a ruler's death. Others point out how conveniently these rituals suppressed dissent, froze court activity, and bought time for succession arrangements behind closed doors. You can almost hear the debate echoing down the corridor as you walk. Was this care, or was this control wearing a sympathetic mask? You begin to realize that royal mourning doesn't hide emotion, it replaces it. Natural reactions are swapped out for approved gestures. A bowed head becomes more important than a broken heart. Tears are acceptable, but only if they fall at the right moment in the right place, observed by the right people. If this is starting to feel exhausting, congratulations, you're empathizing correctly. Imagine maintaining that performance for months or years. There's a modern aside that sneaks into your thoughts here. You can barely keep up a polite smile at a family gathering without checking your phone, and these people were expected to grieve on schedule, in costume, under surveillance, without cracking. Honestly, it's less Downton Abbey and more Big Brother Bereavement Edition. And yes, that's joke number 1. Don't worry, we'll keep it gentle. The colour black itself deserves a pause. You assume black equals sadness because that's what you've inherited culturally, but royal courts helped cement that association deliberately. Before standardised mourning colours, white, purple, and even blue were used in different regions. French queens once wore white for mourning, earning the phrase deuil blanc, or white grief. But black won out because it absorbed light, erased individuality, and photographed beautifully once portraits became political tools. Black made everyone look uniformly subdued, obedient, and, frankly, easier to read. You pass a mirror draped in cloth and notice how often reflection is denied during mourning. This wasn't just symbolic humility, it was practical psychology. Without mirrors, you couldn't adjust your expression constantly. You couldn't check if your grief looked convincing enough. You were forced to internalize the role. And yes, people noticed if you peeked. Court gossip thrived on that kind of detail. Someone always whispered, "Did you see her smile when she thought no one was looking?" Mourning didn't just hide things, it created new opportunities for suspicion. Another mainstream fact settles in quietly. Mourning rituals were often announced before the body was even cold. Messengers rode out with black-edged letters to foreign courts, signalling not just death, but expectations. Allies were expected to mirror the grief. Rivals analyzed its tone. A too brief acknowledgement might be taken as an insult, too elaborate, and it could look like mockery. International relations, it turns out, could hinge on the width of a black border around a piece of paper. Try explaining that to modern diplomacy without sounding unhinged. You also stumble upon a fringe tidbit that feels almost surreal. In some cases, wax effigies of the deceased were displayed and treated as if alive during mourning periods. Servants brought them food, courtiers bowed, conversations happened in their presence. This wasn't denial, it was continuity. The effigy allowed the fiction of stability to persist, while real power quietly shifted elsewhere. It's comforting and unsettling at the same time, like pretending someone's still online long after they've logged off forever. And through it all, you feel the constant pressure to perform sincerity. That's the cruel trick. If mourning were openly acknowledged as theatre, maybe it would be easier. But everyone involved had to pretend this was authentic emotion. The lie had to be believed to work. Break character, and you weren't just rude, you were dangerous. A person who didn't mourn correctly might not mourn loyally. And if you weren't loyal in grief, could you be trusted in anything else? You catch yourself thinking about how this echoes today, just faintly. Public figures apologizing on cue. Social media grief cycles, outrage with expiration dates. It's not the same, but the bones of it are there. Power still prefers emotions it can predict. That's joke number 2, by the way. Dark humor, but still counts. As you move deeper into the palace, the black cloths start to feel less like symbols of sadness and more like curtains. They obscure, they muffle, they hide conversations happening just out of earshot. Mourning slows time on the surface while accelerating it underneath. Successions are planned, alliances renegotiated, enemies identified, all while everyone pretends nothing is happening because everyone is grieving. Historians still argue whether ordinary courtiers believed in the sincerity of these rituals or simply complied out of fear. Diaries suggest a mix. Some people found genuine comfort in the structure, while others privately mocked the excess. One noblewoman wrote that by the 3rd year of court mourning, She could no longer remember what color joy was supposed to be. Whether that was poetic exaggeration or quiet despair is still up for debate. You pause, metaphorically, because the bell tolls again. Same sound, same interval, same reminder. Grief here is measured, rationed, and observed. And as you stand there, wrapped in second-hand sorrow and expensive fabric, you understand the first hidden truth of royal mourning rituals. They were never designed to help you heal. They were designed to make sure everyone else behaved. And if that realization makes you a little uneasy, good. That means you're paying attention. We're just getting started. You notice the clocks next. At first, it feels like a coincidence. Hands frozen at odd angles, pendulums stilled mid-swing. But as you move through the palace, it becomes impossible to ignore. Time itself has been ordered to stop, not metaphorically, literally. When a monarch dies, the clocks are silenced, sometimes within minutes, as if motion were a form of disrespect. You stand there listening to the absence of ticking and realize this is not about honoring the dead. This is about announcing that the ordinary rhythm of life no longer applies. You learn that stopping the clocks is one of the oldest and most widely practiced royal mourning rituals across Europe. A mainstream historical fact confirms that in Britain it became customary to halt timepieces at the moment of a sovereign's death, later restarting them only after the successor was formally proclaimed. The message was simple and chilling. Power has paused, but it has not vanished. The world waits, and waiting, you discover, is a deeply political act. Without clocks, schedules blur, meals shift, audiences are delayed, decisions stall in public while racing ahead in private. You feel the tension this creates, especially for those who rely on predictability. Servants, guards, messengers, anyone whose role depends on knowing when something will happen. By removing time, the court removes certainty. And uncertainty keeps people compliant. It's hard to challenge authority when you don't even know what hour it is. There's a strange intimacy to this pause. You're forced to live in an extended present, a suspended moment of not yet. The king is dead, but the king is not yet replaced. The queen may be gone, but her influence still lingers like perfume in a closed room. This limbo is intentional. It creates space for arrangements to be made quietly, while everyone else is kept politely confused. Here's a quirky tidbit that sounds almost too theatrical to be real. In some royal households, not only were clocks stopped, but watches were confiscated from servants during the initial mourning period. Pocket watches were considered disruptive, even rude. Time was now a centralized privilege. If you needed to know the hour, you had to ask someone higher than you. Imagine needing permission just to know how late you are. Suddenly being punctual feels rebellious. You start to sense how deeply this affects behavior. Without time, people move more slowly. Conversations stretch, silences deepen. You can't rush grief if there's nothing to rush toward. But there's another layer here, one that historians still argue whether it was intentional or simply convenient. By slowing the visible world, the court could delay public demands for clarity. Who rules now? What changes? What stays the same? Mourning buys patience. Patience buys power. You catch yourself smirking at the absurdity, joke number one, because somewhere out there, a servant is probably thinking, I don't know what time it is, but I'm definitely late. Humor has always been a survival tool in rigid systems. Quiet humor, invisible humor, the kind you never let reach your face. The restarting of the clocks is just as controlled as their stopping. It doesn't happen naturally or all at once. It's ceremonial. Sometimes it coincides with a proclamation, sometimes with a funeral, sometimes with a coronation. The first tick after mourning feels loud, even if it's barely audible. It signals that time now belongs to someone else. You realize how unsettling this must have been for the public too. Church bells might toll, but daily life is distorted. Markets open late, courts adjourn, letters arrive with black borders and no clear dates. Foreign ambassadors read these temporal distortions like weather signs. A prolonged pause could suggest instability. A quick restart might imply ruthless efficiency. Either way, clocks become messengers. There's a modern aside humming in your head, how strange it feels when your phone dies and you suddenly lose your sense of time. Multiply that by an entire kingdom and you start to understand the psychological impact. This wasn't just symbolism, it was environmental control. And yes, joke number 2, you'd absolutely be the one sneaking a smartwatch under your sleeve and pretending you didn't. Some scholars point out that timekeeping itself was once a royal prerogative. Control the calendar, control the feast days, control the work hours. Mourning rituals simply made that authority visible again. By stopping time, the monarchy reminded everyone that even the most basic structures of daily life flowed from the crown. Death didn't weaken that message, it amplified it. You also notice who benefits most from the pause. Regents, councils, advisors. The people who operate best behind closed doors. While the public mourns, plans solidify. Rivals are assessed. Support is counted. By the time the clocks restart, the outcome feels inevitable, as if time itself has endorsed the transition. Historians still argue whether common people understood this manipulation or accepted it as sacred tradition. Some records suggest genuine reverence, people stopping their own household clocks in solidarity. Others hint at frustration, especially among merchants and labourers whose livelihoods depended on regular hours. Grief is easier to honour when it doesn't cost you bread. As you stand there, surrounded by frozen faces and frozen minutes, you realise something quietly unsettling. Mourning isn't just about looking backward, it's about deciding when the future is allowed to begin. And in royal courts, that decision was never left to chance. The clocks will start again, they always do, but when they do, they will tick to a new name, a new will, a new order. Until then, you wait, suspended, obedient, and very aware that even time answers to power. You notice the widows long before they speak, if they're allowed to speak at all. They move slowly through the palace, wrapped in layers of black so heavy they seem to pull the air downward. Their footsteps are careful, rehearsed, as if grief itself has weight. These are queens, consorts, empresses, women whose personal loss is immediately converted into a public condition. And you realize with a quiet chill that their mourning is not designed to end, it is designed to last. In many royal courts, widowhood was treated less like a life transition and more like a permanent status. A mainstream historical fact confirms that Queen Victoria's prolonged mourning after Prince Albert's death set a model that rippled across Europe. Decades of black clothing, shuttered rooms, and strict emotional restraint. But what often gets softened in retellings is how this behavior wasn't just devotion, it was expectation. Once a queen entered deep mourning, returning to visibility, or joy, became politically dangerous. You feel the walls close in as you follow her routine, rising before dawn, attending prayers that emphasize humility and endurance, avoiding mirrors, music, and sometimes even conversation. A widow in mourning was expected to become smaller, less visible, less influential, less alive. Grief was the excuse. Control was the outcome. Here's a quirky, unsettling tidbit. In some courts, royal widows were discouraged from remarrying not through explicit bans, but through the social weight of mourning codes. Breaking mourning early to wed again could trigger whispers of impropriety or ambition. In Spain, certain widowed queens adopted near-monastic lifestyles, voluntarily or not, wearing mourning for the rest of their lives. The message was clear: your value now lies in absence. Historians still argue whether this perpetual mourning genuinely protected widows from political danger or deliberately neutralized them. Some suggest that a visibly grieving widow inspired public sympathy and thus safety. Others argue the opposite, that by removing her from court life, male advisers consolidated power while she was cloaked in sanctified silence. You can almost hear the debate hum behind the tapestries, and the rules were relentless. Clothing had to be approved, jewelry was restricted, even the cut of a sleeve could be scrutinized. Mourning attire became a uniform, and deviation was read as rebellion. You imagine the exhaustion of living every day as a symbol rather than a person. Joke number 1 sneaks in here because, honestly, imagine being fashion policed by grief itself. One wrong ribbon and suddenly you're emotionally suspicious. Children complicate everything. Widowed queens were often expected to mourn in ways that didn't interfere with producing heirs or guiding them. If the heir was a minor, the widow might act as regent, balancing authority with enforced humility. Too much power, and she looked manipulative. Too little, and she seemed weak. Mourning was a tightrope walk over a pit of gossip. You also notice how mourning isolates. Widows were often relocated to specific residences, dower houses, country estates, or secluded wings of the palace. This wasn't always exile, but it functioned like one. Away from daily politics, away from allies, away from influence. Silence becomes safer when no one is around to hear you think. There's a modern aside drifting through your mind. People already struggle to grieve without being told to move on or stay strong. Now imagine being told to never move on because your grief has become useful to someone else. That's joke number 2, and it lands softly because it's not really funny at all. Some widows tried to push back. They introduced subtle color into their wardrobes. They hosted small gatherings under the guise of religious observance. They corresponded extensively, building networks through letters when physical presence was discouraged. These acts were quiet, but they mattered. Mourning might shrink your body, but it didn't always shrink your mind. You stumble upon another fringe detail. Locks of hair from deceased husbands were sometimes sewn into mourning garments or kept in lockets worn close to the heart. This wasn't just sentimentality, it was proof. Proof of devotion, proof of loyalty, proof that grief was still active. To stop displaying these tokens could be interpreted as emotional betrayal. Public perception was everything. A mourning queen who appeared too composed was accused of coldness. One who wept too openly risked being seen as unstable. You realized there was no correct amount of grief, only acceptable performance. And the performance never really ended. Historians still argue whether these expectations stemmed from patriarchal anxiety or genuine reverence for marital bonds. Was society honoring love, or was it terrified of a powerful woman freed from marital constraint? The answer, as always, is probably both, and neither feels particularly comforting. As you watch the widow disappear down a corridor lined with black drapery, you understand something deeply unsettling. Royal mourning didn't just mark the end of a marriage, it redefined the rest of a woman's life. Her grief became a cage, beautifully decorated, politely enforced, and almost impossible to escape. And the palace, ever patient, waited to see if she would try. You start paying attention to the fabric, not just the color, but the weight, the weave, the way it moves or doesn't when someone passes you in the corridor. Mourning, you quickly learn, is stitched into cloth as carefully as it's written into law. Every fold, every hem, every thread carries information. You're not just looking at clothes, you're reading a social code. A mainstream historical fact anchors this realization. In many European courts, mourning attire was regulated by sumptuary laws, specifying exactly what materials and colors each rank was permitted to wear after a death. Queens and close relatives wore deep black velvet or silk. Lesser nobles were assigned duller shades, grey, brown, or black wool. Servants often wore black armbands or simple sashes. Grief, it turns out, came in tiers. You feel how these distinctions reinforce hierarchy even in sorrow. A duchess in fine crepe still looks powerful. A lady-in-waiting in rough cloth looks diminished. Mourning doesn't flatten society, it sharpens its edges. Everyone can see exactly where they stand, even when everyone is supposed to be united in loss. Here's a quirky tidbit that feels oddly modern. There were unofficial mourning fashion trends. Tailors specialized in rapid mourning wardrobes, sometimes producing entire black ensembles within days. In Victorian London, certain shops were known for their speed in outfitting grieving aristocrats. Fast grief was profitable. If that doesn't make you raise an eyebrow, nothing will. That's joke number one. Capitalism really will monetize anything, even sorrow. The length of mourning attire mattered as much as the clothing itself. Full mourning, half mourning, and sometimes quarter mourning dictated not just color, but silhouette. Full mourning demanded austere lines, minimal decoration, and heavy fabrics. As time passed, subtle patterns, lighter materials, and small touches of white or lavender were gradually reintroduced. This wasn't about healing, it was about signaling readiness to re-enter social circulation. And historians still argue whether these stages genuinely reflected emotional recovery or simply provided a socially acceptable countdown to normalcy. Did people feel relief when they could finally wear color again, or did they feel pressure to pretend they were over it? The records are ambiguous, which somehow makes the ritual feel even more human and more cruel. You notice how rebellious grief could be expressed through fabric, a slightly softer scarf, a ribbon tied just a bit too playfully. These choices were small, but they were noticed. Court life was essentially a slow-motion fashion surveillance system. Someone always whispered, someone always reported. There's also the matter of who didn't get to mourn properly. Servants were often expected to display grief through accessories rather than full dress changes, a black band here, a dark cap there. Their sorrow was acknowledged but contained. Too much grief might imply closeness. Too little could be read as disrespect. Imagine being told exactly how sad you're allowed to look. Joke number two sneaks in here because honestly, even modern dress codes don't reach that level of emotional micromanagement. Fabric also concealed bodies. Heavy mourning dress restricted movement, posture, even breathing. Corsets tightened, layers piled on. You carry your grief physically, feeling it with every step. This wasn't accidental. Restricted bodies are compliant bodies. Mourning taught stillness. You come across another fringe detail. In some courts, mirrors were covered not only to discourage vanity, but to prevent the display of mourning where outside approved settings. Seeing yourself too often risked adjustment, experimentation, deviation. Better to let the roles settle unquestioned. You think about modern funerals, how people stress over wearing the right thing, afraid of standing out. Multiply that anxiety by months or years under constant observation, and you begin to understand the psychological toll. Clothing becomes a daily test you cannot afford to fail. Historians still argue whether mourning dress empowered or silenced women. Some point out that elaborate mourning wardrobes allowed elite women to maintain visibility and status even while grieving. Others counter that the strict rules limited expression and reinforced dependency. As with so much in royal life, the answer shifts depending on who held the needle. As you move on, the rustle of fabric follows you, a soft, persistent reminder that in royal mourning, even cloth was conscripted. Grief was never just felt. It was worn, measured, and judged, one stitch at a time. You start to notice the audience, not the mourners themselves, but the way eyes track them, how every bowed head, every measured sigh, every carefully timed tear is quietly catalogued. Royal mourning isn't private grief spilling outward, it's public sorrow staged under relentless observation. You don't just mourn, you are watched mourning. A mainstream historical fact grounds this unease. In many monarchies, public mourning rituals were deliberately scheduled and choreographed, from processions through city streets to appearances on palace balconies. These events weren't spontaneous expressions of loss. They were designed to reassure subjects that order still existed. The body might be gone, but the system remained intact. You walk through a procession in your mind, black banners hanging from windows, bells tolling in rhythm, crowds pressed together in hushed compliance. Silence here isn't emptiness, it's participation. Everyone knows when to stand, when to kneel, when to remove a hat. Public grief becomes a loyalty test and failure is conspicuous. Here's a quirky tidbit that feels almost uncomfortable. In some cities, attendance at royal mourning events was effectively mandatory. Absence was noticed. Too little enthusiasm could mark you as politically suspect. Too much enthusiasm could seem insincere. You were expected to hit the narrow band of appropriate sorrow, like an emotional volume knob locked between two clicks. That's joke number one, because honestly, even modern workplace emotions aren't that tightly regulated, though they try. You sense how grief becomes performative. Faces are trained into expressions of solemnity. Bodies move slowly, deliberately. Mourning turns into a shared script everyone has memorized. The effect is powerful, almost hypnotic. Standing in a crowd like that, it's hard not to feel something, even if what you feel is pressure rather than sadness. Foreign observers paid close attention. Ambassadors reported not just what happened, but how it looked. Was the crowd large? Was it quiet? Did the royal family appear unified? Mourning became a diplomatic message. A smooth performance suggested stability. A messy one hinted at fracture. Historians still argue whether these spectacles genuinely united populations in shared loss or primarily functioned as surveillance. Some accounts describe people moved to tears, swept up in collective emotion. Others suggest many attended out of fear or obligation. The truth probably shifted depending on who you were and how closely you were being watched. You also notice who controls the narrative afterward. Official accounts describe immense crowds, universal sorrow, flawless dignity. Dissenting voices rarely survive in the record. Grief is rewritten to fit the desired memory. The performance doesn't end when the procession does. It echoes in chronicles, paintings, and later textbooks. There's a modern aside tugging at you, how social media grief plays out today. Profile pictures turn black, hashtags trend, silence becomes suspicious, participation proves belonging. That's joke number 2, and yes, it lands a little too close to home. You stumble upon another fringe detail. In some cases, hired mourners were used to amplify visible grief, especially if the deceased was unpopular. Professional wailing wasn't about deception so much as insurance. Silence could be dangerous, noise reassured. Children were often positioned carefully during these events, old enough to be seen grieving, young enough to symbolize continuity. Their presence whispered, "The line goes on." Even grief had to look fertile. You realize something quietly unsettling as you stand among the spectators. Public mourning doesn't just show grief, it trains it. Over time, people learn how to feel together, when to feel, and when to stop. Emotion becomes communal property, guided from above. Historians still argue whether this conditioning dulled genuine emotion or simply shaped its expression. Either way, the effect lingered. Generations learned what grief was supposed to look like by watching power perform it. As the procession fades and the bells fall silent, you're left with the afterimage of perfectly organized sorrow. It's impressive, it's moving, and it's deeply controlled. In royal mourning, even sadness has a script, and everyone knows their lines. You notice the children because they look confused. They're dressed in miniature versions of adult mourning clothes, tiny black coats, stiff collars, dark ribbons tied a little too tightly. Their faces are solemn, not because they fully understand death, but because they understand expectation. You realize with a soft ache that royal mourning begins early, very early. A mainstream historical fact anchors this moment. Royal children were routinely included in mourning rituals regardless of age, often appearing in public processions and ceremonies. In some cases, infants were carried through funerals they could not comprehend, their presence serving as symbols rather than participants. Grief, for them, was not an emotion, it was a lesson. You watch how they're taught, hands folded, eyes lowered, steps measured, every movement corrected by a glance from a governess or tutor. Mourning becomes one of the first languages they learn, long before politics, before diplomacy, before love. This is how you behave when someone important dies. This is how you are seen. Here's a quirky tidbit that feels quietly unsettling. Some royal children practiced mourning expressions in advance. Portraits show them with carefully neutral faces, trained to appear dignified rather than distressed. Crying too much was undignified. Smiling was unthinkable. Imagine being coached on your grief before you've even lost someone. That's joke number one, though it lands with a wince, like being told to act natural on camera. You sense how mourning is used as discipline. Children who fidget are corrected. Those who comply are praised. Grief becomes associated with approval. Over time, emotional restraint isn't just expected, it's rewarded. This shapes adults who can suppress instinct and perform stability under pressure. From a dynastic perspective, it's efficient. From a human one, it's heavy. You also notice how mourning reinforces lineage. Children are placed strategically, near the coffin, beside the surviving parent, within clear sight of the crowd. Their presence reassures onlookers that continuity exists. Death hasn't ended the story, it has merely turned a page. The child becomes a living footnote to loss. Historians still argue whether exposing children to these rituals helped them process loss later in life or robbed them of genuine emotional development. Some royal diaries suggest early familiarity with death fostered resilience. Others hint at emotional distance, even numbness. The debate remains unresolved, hovering like a question no one wants to ask too loudly. There's a modern aside drifting through your thoughts. Adults already struggle to teach kids how to handle big feelings without messing it up. Now imagine teaching grief as protocol instead of comfort. That's joke number two, dark but real. You encounter another fringe detail. In some courts, children's mourning periods were shorter than adults, not out of kindness, but practicality. A child who mourned too long risked appearing fragile. Strength had to be visible early. Black clothes came off sooner. Play resumed, but under watchful eyes. Even recovery was managed. You realize how little choice these children had. Their grief wasn't private. It belonged to the dynasty. A tear shed at the wrong moment could become gossip. A lack of tears could become suspicion. Emotional freedom was not on the curriculum. As you watch a young prince stare ahead, face carefully composed, you understand something quietly profound. Royal mourning didn't just teach children how to grieve. It taught them how to belong to a system that valued appearance over authenticity, continuity over comfort. And once that lesson took hold, it rarely let go. You feel the doors before you see them. They're heavy, closed, sometimes locked, and always guarded. As mourning deepens, the palace seems to shrink, folding inward on itself. Rooms go dark. Windows are shuttered. Corridors fall silent. Royal grief, you realize, isn't just worn or performed, it's contained. A mainstream historical fact, confirms this pattern. After the death of a monarch or consort, large sections of royal residences were often closed for extended periods. In Britain, entire wings of palaces were sealed off during deep mourning, their rooms preserved exactly as they were at the moment of death. This wasn't nostalgia, it was control. You walk past doors that won't open, mirrors draped in cloth, chandeliers unlit. The absence of movement feels intentional, like a held breath. Isolation becomes part of the ritual. By reducing space, the court reduces interaction. Fewer rooms mean fewer encounters, fewer conversations, fewer opportunities for rumour. Here's a quirky tidbit that borders on eerie. Some mourning rooms were never reopened. Bedrooms where death occurred were left untouched for decades, becoming shrines of silence. In a few cases, servants were instructed to dust but not rearrange, clean but not change. Time stopped here in a different way. That's joke number one, because nothing says healthy coping like turning your house into a museum of unresolved grief. Isolation also protected power. With fewer gatherings, fewer eyes were present. Decisions could be made quietly. Who was admitted to these closed spaces mattered. Access became currency. If you were invited into a sealed room, you were trusted or useful. Historians still argue whether this seclusion was meant to provide emotional refuge or to prevent political disruption. Some accounts describe widowed royals finding comfort in familiar, preserved spaces. Others suggest the isolation deepened loneliness and dependency. The truth likely shifted depending on who controlled the keys. You notice how isolation affects sound. Without music, without conversation, every footstep echoes. Silence becomes oppressive. It trains attentiveness. People listen more carefully, speak more cautiously. In this environment, secrets don't have to be loud to be dangerous. There's a modern aside flickering in your mind, how people retreat after loss, closing blinds, avoiding calls. That instinct is human, but here it's formalized, enforced, and extended. Grief becomes architecture. That's joke number two, because even emotional burnout has zoning regulations in a palace. You discover another fringe detail. Mirrors were sometimes covered not just to discourage vanity, but to prevent supernatural fears. Some believed mirrors could trap spirits or invite lingering souls during mourning. Whether or not anyone truly believed this, the effect was the same. Less self-awareness, more submission to role. Isolation also reshaped relationships. Servants assigned to mourning quarters formed tight, quiet communities. Others were excluded entirely, creating hierarchies within hierarchies. Being kept out was a reminder of status. Being kept in was a burden disguised as honor. You sense how prolonged isolation blurs days together. Without events, without markers, time stretches. This dulling effect can make people more compliant, more reliant on instruction. When nothing changes, direction becomes everything. Historians still argue whether these sealed spaces preserved dignity or suffocated the living. What's clear is that isolation served the system well. It slowed everything down, reduced risk, and kept grief safely contained within walls thick enough to muffle dissent. As you stand before another closed door, hand hovering but never touching the handle, you understand a quiet truth. Royal mourning didn't just close rooms, it closed possibilities. And the silence behind those doors was never empty. It was full of decisions you weren't meant to hear. You expect funerals to be about ending. Instead, you discover they're about beginnings, carefully disguised ones. As you move closer to the great ceremonial halls, the tone shifts. The stillness of isolation gives way to choreography again. Funerals are the most visible moments of royal mourning, and paradoxically, the least about the person who died. You can feel it in the pacing, in the way officials hover, in how every gesture seems to carry a double meaning. This isn't just goodbye, this is recalibration. A mainstream historical fact grounds this realization. Royal funerals were often designed to reaffirm succession and continuity rather than commemorate individuality. In medieval and early modern Europe, funerals frequently featured both the body of the deceased and symbolic representations of the successor, crowns displayed, titles announced, allegiances subtly redirected. The message was unmistakable. Death has occurred, but authority has not wavered. You watch how the coffin moves through space, how it's positioned beneath banners and heraldry that already belong to the next ruler. Even in death, the monarch is framed as part of a larger machine. Personal virtues are mentioned, yes, but only those that support legitimacy. Flaws are buried faster than the body. Here's a quirky tidbit that feels almost theatrical. Some royal funerals included empty thrones placed conspicuously in view, reminding everyone of absence while quietly preparing them for replacement. The seat is vacant, but not for long. That's joke number one, because nothing says we're grieving like reserving the furniture for the next tenant. You notice how carefully attendance is managed, who stands where, who walks closest to the coffin, who is allowed to touch it. These details aren't sentimental, they're signals. Proximity equals favor. Distance equals caution. Every step is watched, interpreted, remembered. Historians still argue whether the emotional impact of these funerals mattered to those who designed them. Some believe genuine reverence shaped the rituals. Others argue the emotional weight was useful primarily as a stabilizing force. Overwhelming crowds with spectacle, so they had no energy left for uncertainty. Grief, when magnified, can be exhausting. You also sense how timing matters. Funerals are rarely rushed, but they're never delayed without reason. Too quick, and it feels disrespectful. Too slow, and it invites speculation. The interval between death and burial becomes a political buffer zone, a space where alliances can settle while the public waits in solemn patience. There's a modern aside tapping at you how state funerals today still feel like performances. Flags at half-mast, rehearsed speeches, carefully framed camera angles. That's joke number two, because once you see the pattern, it's hard to unsee it. You encounter another fringe detail. In some royal traditions, multiple funerals were held, private ceremonies for the court, public ones for the people, and symbolic rites in distant territories. Each version told a slightly different story, tailored to its audience. The dead monarch became a narrative, adjusted as needed. Children appear again, positioned just so, old enough to be seen, young enough to evoke hope. Their presence softens the spectacle, reminding everyone that the line continues. Even sorrow is made productive. You realize something quietly unsettling as the final rites conclude. The funeral doesn't close a chapter, it seals it. By the time the last bell tolls, the story has already been rewritten to support what comes next. Historians still argue whether this transformation of funerals into political tools diminished their spiritual meaning or simply reflected the realities of power. Either way, the effect was profound. By the time the body was lowered, the future had already been arranged. And as you step away from the ceremony, you understand the hidden truth beneath the incense and hymns. Royal funerals weren't for the dead. They were for the living, specifically the ones who intended to rule next. You start noticing the servants more than the royals. They move quietly, efficiently, dressed in black that is not quite the same black as everyone else's. Their mourning is thinner, borrowed, issued. And yet it is just as closely watched, maybe more so. Because when power grieves, everyone beneath it is expected to grieve too, on command. A mainstream historical fact settles in here. In many royal households, servants were formally required to observe mourning periods, wearing designated symbols of grief and altering their behavior for weeks or months. Work schedules changed, Voices softened, even posture mattered. Grief became part of the job description. You realize how strange that is, to be told when to be sad, how sad to look, and when it's finally acceptable to stop. Servants often wore black armbands, ribbons, or badges rather than full mourning dress. Their sorrow was acknowledged but limited. They were close enough to the dead to be affected, but not important enough to be transformed by loss. Here's a quirky tidbit that feels quietly brutal. In some courts, servants could be punished for incorrect mourning. Laughing too loudly, moving too quickly, or appearing cheerful could result in dismissal. On the other hand, excessive weeping might be interpreted as theatrical or inappropriate. That's joke number one, because apparently even grief had performance reviews. You watch how this creates constant self-monitoring. Servants learn to keep their faces neutral, their voices low, their movements unremarkable. Mourning teaches invisibility. The safest emotion is one that can't be read. Historians still argue whether these expectations fostered solidarity within the household or reinforced rigid class divisions. Some records suggest servants felt genuine attachment to royal families they served for decades. Others hint at resentment, grief imposed rather than felt. The line between loyalty and coercion was never clear. You also notice how mourning affects labour. Kitchens slow down, deliveries are reduced, entertainment ceases, servants do more waiting than working. And waiting, as you've already learned, is a form of control. Without tasks, without distraction, attention turns inward or upward toward whoever is watching. There's a modern aside drifting through your thoughts. Workplaces today offering bereavement leave with strict limits, as if loss runs on a schedule. That's joke number two, because grief clearly did not get the memo. You encounter another fringe detail. In some households, servants were required to attend funerals en masse, positioned where they would be seen but not heard. Their presence inflated the appearance of collective sorrow. Bodies filled space. Silence did the rest. You realize how mourning becomes contagious, not emotionally, but socially. When those above grieve, those below must follow. Refusal isn't an option. Participation proves obedience. Absence invites suspicion. As you watch a line of servants pass, eyes lowered, movements synchronized by habit, you understand something quietly unsettling. Royal mourning didn't stop at the throne. It flowed downward, shaping behavior far beyond the family that had actually lost someone. Grief, in this world, was never private property. It was issued, regulated, and reclaimed, just like everything else. You start noticing the objects, not the obvious ones like coffins or crowns, but the smaller things, the items held too tightly, kept too close, never quite put away. Mourning doesn't just live in rituals or clothing, it settles into possessions, and once it does, it's very hard to remove. A mainstream historical fact anchors this realization. Throughout royal history, mourning relics were commonly preserved and displayed, especially hair, clothing fragments, and personal effects of the deceased. Locks of hair were woven into brooches, rings, and lockets, worn not only as remembrance but as proof of continued devotion. These objects were emotional anchors and political signals. You imagine the weight of one of these keepsakes against your chest. It's intimate, almost tender, but in a royal context, intimacy is never just personal. Wearing a relic publicly declared loyalty to the dead, and by extension to their legacy. Removing it too soon could be read as forgetfulness. Keeping it too long might suggest resistance to change. Here's a quirky tidbit that feels oddly unsettling. Some mourning jewelry was designed to be deliberately visible during court appearances. Hairwork braided into dark enamel, inscriptions hidden on the inside of rings, miniature portraits only revealed at the right moment. That's joke number one, because nothing says I'm coping like turning your grief into an accessory with layers. You notice how these objects blur the line between memory and control. A widow clutching a locket is seen as faithful. A courtier displaying a ribbon from a funeral becomes trustworthy. Mourning items function like badges, silently communicating alignment. You don't need to speak. Your objects speak for you. Historians still argue whether these relics provided genuine comfort or trapped people in prolonged attachment. Some diaries describe solace in tactile remembrance, touching something that once touched the deceased. Others describe suffocation, an inability to move forward because the past was always physically present. Grief, it seems, can harden into form. You also notice how these objects circulate. A ring passed down, a piece of cloth cut and shared. Mourning relics become heirlooms, carrying emotional expectations across generations. The original grief fades, but the obligation remains. You're not just remembering someone you never met, you're honoring how you're supposed to feel about them. There's a modern aside tapping gently at you, how people keep old texts, voicemails, clothes they can't throw away. Multiply that by dynasty, and suddenly your sentimental drawer becomes a vault. That's joke number 2, because at least your old hoodie isn't a state symbol. You encounter another fringe detail. Some royal mourning objects were believed to carry protective qualities. Hair was thought to preserve essence. Clothing absorbed presence. Whether believed literally or not, the superstition added weight. Disposing of these items could feel dangerous, even disrespectful. You realize how these relics freeze time in a personal way, just as clocks froze time publicly. The past becomes portable, grief becomes wearable, and as long as the object exists, the mourning can be reactivated at any moment, simply by touching it. Historians still argue whether this materialization of grief was a way to cope with loss in eras of high mortality, or a method of emotional regulation enforced by court culture. Either way, the result was the same. Grief lingered long after it might otherwise have softened. As you step away from these objects, you understand something quietly heavy. Royal mourning wasn't content to live in memory alone. It needed proof, something solid, something visible, something that could be passed down, pointed to, and never fully let go. You feel the eyes from beyond the palace now. Not literal ones, but imagined, calculated, constantly anticipated. Every ribbon, every silence, every delayed announcement is no longer just internal theatre. Foreign courts are watching, closely. Royal mourning, you realize, is never domestic. It is international signalling dressed up as sorrow. A mainstream historical fact settles into place here. European courts routinely adjusted their own mourning practices in response to the deaths of foreign monarchs, especially allies or rivals. The length, tone, and visibility of mourning were diplomatic gestures, carefully calibrated to communicate respect or distance. A day too short could insult. A week too long could look sarcastic. Grief, somehow, had a foreign policy. You imagine ambassadors scribbling notes while watching black-draped processions. They don't just report what happened, they interpret it. Was the court solemn or stiff? Unified or fragmented? Did the heir appear confident? Was the widow too prominent? Mourning becomes a cipher, decoded for clues about stability, ambition, and weakness. Here's a quirky tidbit that feels almost absurd. Some courts delayed announcing deaths until they could coordinate an appropriate international mourning response. Timing wasn't about shock or compassion, it was about choreography. That's joke number 1, because apparently even death needed a PR rollout. You sense how fragile perception is during these moments. A rival kingdom might interpret extended mourning as paralysis. An ally might see it as devotion. Neutral observers watch for cracks, missed cues, awkward ceremonies, uneven participation. Mourning doesn't hide instability, it advertises it if mishandled. Historians still argue whether monarchs consciously used mourning to intimidate rivals or simply followed tradition that others overanalyzed. Some letters suggest deliberate signaling. Prolonged silence meant to unsettle, lavish funerals meant to impress. Others hint at genuine confusion, courts unsure how their grief would be read abroad. Either way, interpretation mattered more than intention. You also notice how foreign royals mirror each other. A death in one court triggers black borders in another. Chains of mourning ripple across Europe, linking palaces in synchronized solemnity. It looks respectful. It also reinforces hierarchy. Who mourns whom and how publicly reveals who matters. There's a modern aside drifting through your mind, how governments today issue statements after international tragedies, each word weighed, each silence noticed. That's joke number 2, because nothing says empathy like a carefully vetted press release. You encounter another fringe detail. In some cases, foreign courts exaggerated their mourning to outshine rivals, turning grief into competitive display. More banners, longer silence, bigger processions. The dead became unwilling participants in status contests they never consented to. You realize how exhausting this must have been, grieving while constantly imagining how your grief looked from hundreds of miles away. Emotion filtered through optics. Sorrow adjusted for audience. Even solitude felt performative when you knew someone, somewhere, would report on it. Historians still argue whether this international mourning culture promoted stability through shared norms or intensified rivalry by turning ritual into comparison. What's clear is that no court mourned alone. Grief crossed borders faster than armies. As you pull back from the palace and look outward, you understand a quiet truth. Royal mourning wasn't just about honoring the dead or steadying the living. It was about being seen by friends, by enemies, by anyone waiting for a sign of weakness. And in that silence, everyone listened. You start hearing the prayers more clearly now. They echo through chapels thick with incense and low light, their words soft, measured, repetitive. Religion, you realize, is doing more than offering comfort. It's managing grief, directing it, keeping it safely contained within acceptable boundaries. Royal mourning leans heavily on faith, not just for solace, but for order. A mainstream historical fact grounds this moment. Churches and clergy played central roles in royal mourning rituals, from extended prayer cycles to mandatory attendance at memorial masses. In many monarchies, specific liturgies were prescribed for different stages of mourning, reinforcing obedience, humility, and divine continuity. God, it turns out, was very good at supporting hierarchy. You sit quietly as prayers emphasize patience, endurance, and submission to divine will. Loss is framed as part of a grand plan, suffering as virtuous, questioning as dangerous. These messages don't just soothe grief, they neutralize it. Anger fades, doubt feels inappropriate, faith becomes a pressure valve. Here's a quirky tidbit that feels almost too neat. Some royal prayer books included customized passages for specific dynasties, subtly linking obedience to God with loyalty to the crown. That's joke number 1, because nothing says free spiritual reflection like pre-approved grief scripts. You notice how religion provides language when other language is forbidden. If you can't openly question succession, you can pray. If you can't express fear, you can kneel. Ritual replaces conversation. Repetition replaces processing. It works, at least on the surface. Historians still argue whether these religious frameworks genuinely helped mourners cope or primarily served as tools of emotional regulation. Some personal writings suggest deep comfort in shared faith. Others hint at resentment, especially when prayer felt compulsory rather than chosen. Belief is powerful, but so is enforcement. You also sense how religion shields authority. Clergy often stood between the public and the grieving royals, interpreting events as divinely sanctioned. Death wasn't a failure of leadership, it was God's timing. Succession wasn't political maneuvering, it was providence. The system absolved itself through faith. There's a modern aside murmuring in your mind how people are still told everything happens for a reason in moments of loss. That's joke number 2, because if there is a reason, it rarely shows up on time to explain itself. You encounter another fringe detail. Some courts increased religious observance during mourning, not out of devotion but surveillance. Attendance at services was noted. Absence questioned. Prayer became another visibility test. Faith, like grief, had to be seen. You realize how religion slows emotional movement. Repeated rituals create rhythm, structure, and predictability. For a shaken court, that stability is comforting. For those in power, it's invaluable. When everyone kneels together, no one stands apart. Historians still argue whether religion softened the harshness of royal mourning or disguised it. What's clear is that faith provided language, pacing, and authority when emotions threatened to spill beyond control. As the final prayer fades into silence, you understand something quietly profound. Royal mourning didn't just ask people to grieve, it taught them how to grieve, and more importantly, how not to question why. You start to notice the tension when someone moves too quickly, not physically, emotionally. A laugh that comes a little too soon, a visit made without proper black, a room reopened before permission is given. Breaking mourning rules isn't dramatic, it's subtle, and that's what makes it dangerous. A mainstream historical fact settles into place here. Ending royal mourning early or failing to observe it correctly often resulted in social punishment rather than legal consequence. Invitations stopped arriving. Whispers followed. Support quietly evaporated. The system rarely needed to punish openly. Disapproval did the work. You sense how powerful that quiet pressure is. There's no announcement saying mourning has been violated, no bell, no proclamation, just a shift in temperature. People stop making eye contact, conversations shorten, doors close a little faster. Mourning, once broken, marks you. Here's a quirky tidbit that feels uncomfortably human. Some royals tested the boundaries deliberately, introducing a single coloured flower, attending a small gathering framed as religious, allowing music in private rooms. These were emotional feelers, not rebellions, and that's joke number 1, because nothing says defiance like a beige ribbon daring to exist. Historians still argue whether early breaks in mourning were driven by emotional necessity or political calculation. Was a young prince eager to reclaim normal life, or signalling readiness to rule? Was a widow stepping into society again, seeking companionship, or asserting independence? The same act could be read a dozen ways depending on who was watching. You notice how uneven the consequences are. Powerful figures get more leeway. Marginal ones get none. A popular heir might shorten mourning and be praised for strength. A controversial widow might do the same and be accused of coldness. Mourning rules pretend to be universal, but enforcement is anything but. There's a modern aside flickering through your thoughts, how quickly people are judged for moving on too fast, especially women. That's joke number 2, because grief apparently runs on a universal stopwatch no one has ever seen. You encounter another fringe detail. In some courts, mourning rules were deliberately vague toward the end, creating anxiety. Without a clear signal that grief was officially over, people hesitated. That hesitation preserved control. If no one knows when it's safe to relax, everyone stays careful. You realize how much courage it took to be the first person to smile again, or dance, or host a meal that wasn't penitential. Ending mourning wasn't just personal recovery, it was a public gamble. Someone always went first, and someone always paid. Historians still argue whether these transitions softened over time or remained emotionally charged until the very end. Diaries suggest a mix: relief threaded with fear, joy tangled with guilt. Mourning didn't end cleanly, it frayed. As you watch someone step out of black for the first time, you understand something quietly sharp. Royal mourning wasn't a door that opened, it was a line you crossed, slowly, visibly, and with everyone watching to see if you'd fall. You start to notice what isn't being talked about. The palace is still draped in black, prayers still echo, faces still solemn. But certain topics have simply vanished. Conversations stop mid-sentence, letters are delayed or quietly destroyed. Mourning, you realize, doesn't just express grief, it smothers inconvenient truths. A mainstream historical fact settles in uncomfortably here. Periods of royal mourning were frequently used to suspend courts, halt investigations, and delay legal or political accountability. Trials paused. Accusations went unanswered. With the kingdom officially in sorrow, scrutiny was considered improper. Silence became sanctified. You feel how effective this is. Who would dare raise a scandal while bells are tolling? Who would question decisions while widows wear black and children stand solemnly in line? Mourning creates moral cover. Any challenge can be dismissed as tasteless, disrespectful, even cruel. Here's a quirky tidbit that feels almost cynical. Some proclamations explicitly banned unseemly talk during mourning, an intentionally vague phrase that could include gossip, criticism, or inconvenient truth. That's joke number one, because nothing says honor the dead like aggressively ignoring the living mess they left behind. You begin to sense how rumors don't disappear, they hibernate. Affairs, illegitimate heirs, financial disasters, suspicious deaths, all wrapped neatly in black cloth and tucked away for later. Later, of course, often never comes. By the time mourning ends, public attention has moved on. Historians still argue whether this silencing was deliberate strategy or accidental byproduct. Some believe mourning provided a necessary cooling-off period after emotional upheaval. Others argue it was routinely exploited to reset narratives and erase momentum. The timing, in many cases, feels far too convenient to be innocent. You notice how mourning reshapes memory. Official eulogies emphasize virtue. Failures soften. Conflicts dissolve into vague language about difficult times. The dead are edited, and once that version is repeated enough, at funerals, in prayers, in records, it hardens into history. There's a modern aside whispering through your thoughts, how bad news still gets buried during holidays, disasters, or national tragedies. That's joke number 2, because timing has always been the quietest form of censorship. You encounter another fringe detail. Some royal archives restricted access to documents specifically during mourning periods, citing respect. Papers went missing, letters were refiled. The administrative pause created opportunities for selective memory. Grief didn't just slow time, it rearranged it. You realize how powerless the public was during these moments. Mourning discouraged outrage, grief demanded patience. Anyone pushing for answers risked appearing heartless. Silence wasn't just expected, it was enforced by social shame. Historians still argue whether this burial of scandal shaped long-term stability or merely postponed reckoning. In some cases, suppressed truths resurfaced generations later. In others, they vanished completely, lost beneath layers of ritualized sorrow. As you move through the hushed corridors past faces trained into reverence, you understand something quietly unsettling. Royal mourning didn't just hide pain, it hid responsibility. And the deeper the grief appeared, the easier it was for uncomfortable truths to disappear without a trace. You feel it loosening before anyone admits it. The black fabric fades slightly at the edges. Bells toll less often. Doors that stayed closed for months creak open without ceremony. No proclamation announces the end of mourning, because by now you understand that royal rituals rarely end cleanly. They simply dissolve quietly once they've done their work. A mainstream historical fact brings this moment into focus. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, many European courts deliberately shortened or simplified mourning rituals. Industrial schedules, mass media, and constitutional limits made prolonged performative grief impractical. What once stabilized power now risked looking archaic or even absurd. You sense how fragile the old system had become. Newspapers printed too quickly, photographs captured unguarded expressions, public patience shortened. Mourning that once inspired reverence now invited criticism. The spell weakened as soon as people could see behind the curtain. Here's a quirky tidbit that feels quietly symbolic. Some courts officially abandoned strict mourning codes, not with announcements, but by simply failing to enforce them. No punishment, no reminders, just silence. That's joke number one, because nothing ends tradition faster than mild collective neglect. Historians still argue whether royal mourning faded because society grew more emotionally honest or simply less willing to perform. Some suggest the rituals collapsed under their own weight. Others argue they were victims of modern speed. Grief no longer had time to be ceremonial when life itself accelerated. You notice how remnants linger. State funerals still choreograph sorrow. Dress codes still signal respect. Silence is still expected at certain moments. The rituals didn't vanish, they thinned, becoming symbolic rather than totalizing. Power learned to grieve faster. There's a modern aside drifting through your thoughts, how people still feel pressure to mourn correctly, even without crowns involved. That's joke number two, because apparently we retired the monarchy but kept the emotional rules. You realize something quietly clarifying now. Royal mourning rituals were never really about death. They were about managing life after death, who spoke, who waited, who benefited from silence. Once those tools became too visible, they lost their effectiveness. Historians still argue whether anything valuable was lost when these rituals faded. Some believe structure helped people cope. Others believe it delayed healing and rewarded obedience. The truth probably sits somewhere in between, like so much history, messy, human, unresolved. As the palace slowly returns to color, you understand the final hidden truth. Mourning rituals didn't disappear because grief became less important. They disappeared because power found other ways to manage it. And with that realization, the corridors grow quieter, not with control this time, but with release. Now the pacing softens. You let the images blur gently. The black cloth folding away, the clocks ticking again, the echoes of bells dissolving into distance. The weight you've been carrying loosens, just a little. Whatever these rituals were meant to do, they no longer hold you. History exhales. You do too. The palace fades, leaving only a calm, dim hallway that leads nowhere in particular, and that's okay.